Hi, I'm Jarrett Fuller. Welcome to Scratching the Surface. A few years ago, the company formerly known as Facebook changed their name to Meta, as they said they were refocusing the company on this idea of the metaverse, this all-encompassing term to describe the spaces that we inhabit when we are inside virtual reality systems. Last year, Apple launched their headset. They called that the Vision Pro. When Apple announced the Vision Pro, they never used the term metaverse or the term virtual reality, and instead coined a new term to describe their new platform, spatial computing. When we start talking about spatial computers, we talk about environments, we talk about structures, dimension, depth, interiors, exteriors. In other words, so much of the language that we use for this emerging medium is architectural. And I'm not sure there are any architects who have thought more about the implications of spatial computing, virtual reality, the metaverse, whatever you want to call it, both inside a headset and for architectural practice generally, than Lara Lesmes and Fredrik Hellberg. In 2013, Lara and Fredrik founded Space Popular, an architectural studio that explores the relationship between media and the built environment. This work takes the form of buildings, exhibitions, public artwork, furniture, and even virtual architecture. Earlier this year, they were appointed professors in the Institute of Architecture at the University of Applied Arts in Vienna. We begin this conversation talking about the 2021 exhibition Freestyle that looked at the history of the influence of media on architecture, from the printing press to virtual reality. This provides a jumping off point, I think, to talk about how the definitions of architecture have changed and what happens when we move from media being about architecture to media being architecture itself, something that we can actually step inside of. On the back half, we talk about their own practice and how designing for virtual spaces has influenced their design for physical real world building, and how they talk about all of this with their students, what it means for the next generation of architects who might be sitting at this intersection between the physical and the virtual. I think you can tell from this conversation that there's so much to think about in these ideas, and I feel like we could have easily kept going for another hour. If you like this show and what we do here, you can support our work by joining our Substack. We have a monthly newsletter that is free for everyone, as well as a paid tier that gets you a bonus interview each month and helps keep this show free for everybody all the time. Our paying subscribers truly enable us to do this work and keep the show going. So if you want more of this in the world, if you like what we're doing, please consider signing up and supporting our work. You can go do that on our website. Thank you as always for listening, and here's my conversation with Space Popular's Lara Lesmes and Fredrik Hellberg. I actually want to start this conversation with the exhibition that you staged in 2021 called Freestyle: Architectural Adventures in Mass Media. And in the exhibition text for that show, you wrote, "For the first time, instead of being represented by media, today architectural experiences can exist wholly inside it. It's time to review our description of architecture as something only physical." We'll get to the first part of that in a second about being inside of media, but I actually want to start with the second part of that statement. It's time to review our description of architecture as something only physical. So, how do you both define architecture today?
I think we define it as a spatial experience that, I think you can have now, given the new forms of access that you have to media. I think now you can experience a space that is not physical. No, so we have been looking at representations of architecture for centuries now. No, and some like incredibly immersive and convincing. Like when you look at frescoes, no, like 300-400 years old, where feel like there is a space that is there and you are still kind of experience it in one way or another, but there is always a moment when you understand the flatness and that breaks the illusion. I think that's the same effect that happens when you look at any kind of screen. But the fact that you can now experience media spatially means that that is the language of architecture. And we like to say that so far, anything that we would experience in the computer, even if it was 3D graphics, it's still contained within the screen, and the screen comes from the legacy of paper, right? It's two-dimensional. Whereas, like when you are using some form of binoculars, no, or some form of lenses that you put on your eyes, that comes from the legacy of spatial experience, and therefore architectural experience, whether that is, let's say, simulated or created through media or not, that is another story, whether we want to define if it's a simulation or if it's the actual thing. But I think that the fact that the way in which we are experiencing it means that it functions in that way, three-dimensionally, and therefore it responds maybe to the criteria with which we would design and experience three-dimensional space. And therefore I think it's inherently different.
Yeah, there's so many things to say about about this. I mean, also in architecture as a discipline, this has a history because especially, let's say, in the last 80 years or maybe 100 years, architects started to really think of themselves as these builders of the world, and that a lot of their ideas would need to be experienced or thought of before they were built. You know, the whole tradition of paper architects. And there is a recent history of a kind of, at least within the discipline, a deep respect for architecture that was too wild to be built, let's say.
Right.
And that's the kind of legacy that we were trained in, but we try to not engage too much in that and think about architecture in a more as a more popular medium, like beyond the just the fact that we all sit and live and work in buildings and we're born in buildings rather than this. And we obviously do a lot of research and work within purely virtual spaces, like wearing a headset, etc. But I think the way we're thinking about it more is the sort of hybridization of our experiences where, I mean, more and more every day, obviously, but within our lifetime, so much of the spaces that we experience are not physical in that sense, either if they are on a screen or if they're on it's some form of mediated way that it reaches you.
But in 2021, when we were saying this, I think, thinking back, I think I meant literally headsets or some kind of hardware that allows you to experience the space three-dimensionally. And we have kind of changed, not that statement per se, but our interest has widened in how we deal with this issue in our practice, but also how we deal with this issue in academia.
Yeah,
that's very true. That's very true, because we were at that time really starting to do a lot of research in these social VR spaces where you're walking around with an avatar and you're sitting on furniture, you're opening doors, you're going through rooms, etc. And it's like,
so I really
this is architecture, clearly. Even if you would call a drawing, just looking at a drawing of a building and you're imagining being in it, yes, that's also.
It's not the same. You're envisioning it, but this was truly a spatial experience.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. There's so much we can. You've set up basically all the rest of my questions that I had for you in that answer, and so I want to actually like pause on that for a second. Actually, just go back in time a little bit because Lara, you just mentioned kind of the evolution of your thinking. I'm wondering if we can actually go back to where this interest in media started for you, Fredrik. I understand when you both met at the AA and were studying at the AA, and Fredrik, from what I understand, you wrote an essay on virtual architecture while you were a student there. Can you both just tell me a little bit about where this interest in the intersection or overlap and relationship between architecture and media developed for you?
I think a lot of these interest actually comes from a broadly shared kind of methodology within architecture that was shared beyond the interest in the digital, because there was a lot of interest in the 90s, 80s and 90s in simulations, in French philosophy, writing of kind of imagined space and dream space, etc. I think that
Right.
was, we kind of belong to that generation of students who were at the tail end of that was kind of disappearing a bit from the practice of architecture. But it's one of the reasons why I felt like this is a place, like a discipline for me.
Yeah.
We we love building buildings by hand, but that's at least where kind of my strong interest started, and kind of did projects on the way we experience spaces and dreams, and just imagining the future potential of these technologies that were yet to come, like VR and AR. Like earliest writings around this were like around 2006, when it seemed like maybe in 5 years, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, God knows, because there was no proof at all that we were going to get to
Right.
experience it in our lifetime. And I think then that with also with our shared interest in popular culture and how popular culture is influencing the way we desire different kinds of spaces, and therefore different types of space it gets created sort of because of what we see and experience in media. And we realize that this is not a shared interest we have in just the sort of magically unreachable kind of dream space, but this is really
Mm.
relevant for how we see and experience spaces today.
I want to kind of go back to the freestyle exhibition for a second now with that context. And I promise we won't spend all this time on an exhibition that's 4 years old now. And you've
No,
said
but
you're
it's so relevant for so much of the work that we've done, and we spent over 2 years researching that project, and it's something that we
okay.
come back to again and again and again. So it links to so many of our projects in so many ways. So it's
I
good.
I sensed that also. I get a little self-conscious when I start dwelling on older projects. I realize you have new things, but I also felt like it was a catalyst for a lot of other things, and it felt like it explained a lot of the work that you did. So I'm glad. Thank you for letting me dwell on this for a little bit. That exhibition was this sort of hybrid physical digital, or maybe we could say hybrid digital virtual exhibition that was looking at 6 centuries of architectural style in the UK through the lens of different media, the printing press, the internet, virtual reality. And Lara, I'm struck by something you said earlier when I asked about how you kind of define architecture, and you immediately went to how we experience it through media. And I'm wondering if you can talk to me more about how you think about the role of media, of mediums, in our understanding of architecture, in our understanding of space. How do you see media as being a way to help us understand this condition, this experience that you were just talking about?
Yeah, we that exhibition that also owes a lot, including its brilliant title, to Shumi Bose, who
Oh
was
yeah.
the curator and someone whom we have worked with a lot throughout the years. That in that exhibition we were looking at we began by looking at style, and we were quite interested in that as a phenomena that needs to be collective, or I mean, you can say that an individual has a style, but I think it's kind of almost impossible, or well, I don't know. We were more interested in the idea of style and how it
Yeah.
develops as something collective, and how that can only happen at a certain scale via media, no? So media becomes this vessel or this
Mm.
vehicle for architecture to travel through. We were very inspired by the Mario Karpov,
I was just
uh,
going to bring that book up. Yeah.
right, who says that like buildings could not travel, so people had to. And that kind of put things in perspective for us, no? Like where you're like, yeah, if these things need a vessel, and then that vessel has complete power, mediation
Yeah.
on what you are going to perceive, or how many channels or layers are going to be transferred, but then also your past experiences will help you build on top of that. And then that touches on the other side, which is the issue of could be the affordance, but also more in general, the semiotics, no? And how your mind will work with certain cues and autocomplete the rest. And that then magically like also opened up these avenues for thinking about the virtual as not just something that is delivered through media, but something that also maybe is partly constructed by you based on certain cues, right? So, I mean, I've deviated now from the initial question. But yeah, I think, I mean, what was very important for, or like really crystallized for us doing this exhibition was this notion of like looking at style, the developments in style and the developments in media as two parallel timelines, and see the acceleration in the emergence of styles as you see the emergence of media that is a faster distribution or it provides more layers of information. And then styles travel faster and faster. So this like vessels, streams, or whatever we want to call it, was basically about what was very fascinating was to be able to observe this.
And I mean, that was the hypothesis. And in the end, like, you know, it seemed pretty obvious that like the kind of the more readily available the media is and the faster it can spread, the more faster ideas can spread. And
Right.
the style in which we build buildings is a very, very, very small part of the ideas that can be spread, but it's a very significant one because it's one of the few things we cannot carry around with us. But in the end, like the research we did kind of proved this hypothesis in a very, very clearly visual way. It just like it's so clear that to like, okay, the time it takes to get a book from Italy to England,
Right.
literally and even the knowledge that new ideas were coming around. But I think the thing that really, more than that and the method and the research, the thing that sticks with us, that also connects with other projects that we have done before and after, is this kind of imagining, almost this reality shifting idea of kind of imagining what it's like to live in a reality, in this case, past realities, where ideas were limited by media that's slower than the media we've gotten used to now. And you don't have to go to such extremes to just seeing, in a time where if you're a middle class family in Europe in the 19th century and you maybe had a few photographs, but you got a new
Right.
photograph from a place you've heard about, and just imagining the kind of explosive power of being able to visually see things that your body could not travel to. And so again and again, almost whatever we see, we experience, we try to kind of put ourselves in that position to imagine, of course, what is it like now and what will it be like in the future when we are in the middle.
You've talked a lot about this, or you use this phrase often, architecture at the speed of the spoken word. What does that mean? How does that kind of connect to this? Can you just explain
Yeah,
that to me a little more?
yeah, it's funny. It's something that we've thought about a lot, and we haven't actually really written about it much, but it's again something that we thought was a sort of wild, crazy speculation for some time in our lifetime, but it seems now imminent. And it basically means that with the media evolution we have to start preparing ourselves for a reality where, because of these technologies, AI mainly, but also the representation of space around us through
Mm-hmm.
AR glasses or whatever it is, that the possibility that the space around you, like the style of it, or what it looks like, or what it can do, can manifest as fast as you can think and speak it.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, it was funny because the interviews we did in 2020, it would take like 10 minutes to talk about this. Imagine you're talking with a computer and it can understand you instantly
Right.
and it can tell you something back instantly, and not just like, yes, I'll put on a timer, but like, here is the entire world you just described to me.
Yeah.
And obviously the steps to that being something you can interact with, something you can move around in space, now seems pretty obvious. But it's
Right.
basically that. And like, if we think of the kind of, the extreme of a theater stage or an opera stage that can transform into a different world within a few hours, and the magic of that, obviously now we're talking what we were talking about. Imagine a world where every single citizen has the capacity to
Yeah.
speak their environment and their life around them, basically. And we haven't actually done any projects about that since it seemed now so plausible, because we, like most people, are so shocked and just almost do
Right.
not know where to start to think about the fact that like, okay, this is no longer a speculative idea. This is like preparing for this in a few years, possibly.
As you're saying that, and as you were answering the previous question, I was starting to think about something that I'm not totally sure I agree with, and I'm not totally sure I'm not totally sure it even makes sense in my head, and so I kind of want to just like throw this to you and see how you respond to it, because I'm struck by the way you both are talking about this relationship between the built world and the representation of the built world, whether that is a simulation, which is a word you used earlier, which I really liked, or a photograph, or a book, or just seeing pictures on the internet, or the fact that like you can see the space I'm in behind me, and I can see the space you're in behind you. Do you think those simulations, do you think those reproductions, do you think uh, the reproduction of a photograph in a book that then travels, is that also a form of spatial experience? Is that also, to use your definition of architecture from my first question, is the simulations, are those also architectural? Is the photograph an architectural act? How do you think about the reproduction or the simulation as it relates to something that actually physically exists?
Mm.
I mean, I think if you something that you can experience three-dimensionally, that literally you can look around it,
Yeah.
and that when you move, there is,
Right.
it
Right.
shifts with you, which is not something that happens with a screen or with a photograph. I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
So, anything that you can experience three-dimensionally, I think it gives you something quite close to a spatial experience.
Right.
Some of the senses are missing, but I think it gives you, I think the visual sense, and if it's like audiovisual, I think it provides quite a lot of what a spatial experience is. When you are looking at anything, a drawing, a photograph, even if it's an abstract drawing, a plan or a section, I don't think that provides a spatial experience, but I think some people has the capacity to look at that, and because of
Right.
their knowledge and their background and their past experiences, they can maybe autocomplete a spatial experience in their minds. So I think they can be cues that help you build that, but I don't think they are the spatial experiences in themselves.
That makes sense to me. And so that is the difference, or that is the translation, to go back to the first question. I sorry that I keep kind of looping back to that. That's the
Yeah.
difference. A photograph is media about architecture, and virtual reality, a headset, etc. That is now the architecture becoming media because we are actually stepping inside of it. That's the difference, right?
I I would say so, and I know this can hurt some people, but some architects especially. But I do think that it's a difference, and there is still a lot of like most of like the b- buildings that are built to be experienced with, let's say, a virtual reality headset are still representations of physical buildings to be built. But I do think that that doesn't take away from the fact that those are spatial experiences in themselves. And with that, then comes also the amount of thought that one wants to put on the rest of the experience, which is where your physical body that is wearing the glasses is. And I think
Yeah.
when you start thinking about that layer as well, you can build a lot more of that experience. And we're quite interested in that because you are basically experiencing what we're calling now, we're trying out this term of like you're experiencing a transmedia space. And
Mm.
that to us is quite interesting because it has all these layers of design in different mediums. And that to me is very exciting.
Yeah, tell me more about that term, transmedia, being inside of a transmedia space. What does that mean? What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean the it can mean many different things. The term, like we take it from the transmedia
Mhm.
used
Yeah.
in media. So I mean, transmedia is more described as like comes from storytelling, no, and the fact that a transmedia
Yeah.
story It's basically a story that you get to experience through many different mediums. So whatever, Star Wars, you watch the movies, but then there is also all the other materials
Right,
that
right.
build that world. And it links very much to the practice of world building. That is not necessarily something we work so much with. But we do think that we had to come up with this term as we were actually setting up the master program, the studio at the master program where we are here now working on in Vienna. And we had to come up with a term that helped us define both, let's say, like the kind of very direct, let's create spaces that can be experienced with a headset, but we think also of where your body is, and we create part of it physically and we build part of it virtually. But we also wanted to talk about the fact that the way in which we live in a city is heavily altered because of media. And in this case, I'm speaking about 2D media or media inside our smartphones or the internet in itself. Just like something as simple as that is having a huge impact in the ways in which we live. So these are two radically different ways of understanding basically the impact of media in the built environment. And we wanted a term that allowed us that was an umbrella term for all of this. And that's where we felt that both of those things are somehow transmedia. My life, even if I throw away all my headsets, I still live a transmedia life in the sense that now I'm here with you, and I'm heavily relying on this medium to organize my life. I sometimes wonder if they are stepping outside of architecture and going into like sociology, or where I'm completely not prepared to talk about. But it's hard to think about architecture and at all scales without considering things like this.
Yeah, I mean that's sort of why I asked, because as soon as you said it's a transmedia experience, I was like I immediately was kind of thinking I feel like everything right now is a transmedia experience. And what that's making me think about, and I want to hear how you think about this actually in your process, because you've spent a lot of time building inside of virtual reality spaces, inside of, I know you don't like the term metaverse, but inside of these kind of spatial computing spaces. And something that's interesting to me about these spaces, there's a couple things that I want to hear how you think about them. One is the fact that it's sort of something that is different is that it starts as a completely blank space. There is nothing there. And so you are actually designing everything. You are not, it's not that you are putting a building on a site that already exists. You're also designing the site. You're designing what the landscape is. You're designing the sky. That whole spatial experience is something that is fully designed, which feels like something that is different than, and I don't mean to make this such a binary, but a physical building, a building outside of that space. But the other piece of this that's interesting that I hadn't thought about until you were just speaking, and when you were kind of delineating between the photograph and the spatial experience, and using this term transmedia, is that inside of these spaces, we talk about them as being inside of spaces, but they are also just a series of screens that are simulating a three-dimensional space. You can move through the space, but it is a simulation of moving through a space. You're still sitting in a physical space outside of that. And that tension is really interesting to me, that you are designing these full spaces, everything from the grass to the sky to the hills to the valleys to the structures, and then you're moving through those structures, but you're also inside of another structure where you are sitting down, not moving. I don't know what my question is there, but could you sort of talk me through those tensions a little bit and how you approach them when you're designing in these spaces?
Yeah,
Does that make sense? Do you know what I mean?
no, absolutely.
Yeah, you're like, it's not a question, but help.
Yeah. Yes, please help me.
No, we often speak about this often comes up in the role of or where does the physical body end up
Yeah.
in this kind of situation where so much of what your mind is experiencing obviously is using the senses, but the body is somewhere always.
Right.
And I mean, I think the most interesting thing to say about this that we always come back to is the fact that the way that these technologies are working right now, it is such a specific time in history that will be gone before we know it. And also it's right now still, even if, these mega corporations are doing everything they can to make this, the Christmas present of the year sort of mass consumerism, and they wouldn't want
Yeah.
anything else than people to buy headsets rather than smartphones, which will probably happen at some point. But it is still a very niche experience,
Mm-hmm.
largely because this connection with the body doesn't really work yet. The endless videos of people running into their TV, or, the fact that you're blindfolded if you have children or pets, it's just the worst piece of technology for integrating into our lives. I mean, for most cases, bad, like all of the things that I mentioned.
Yeah.
Obviously, other small things as a regular user is great because like you can't bring your smartphone in there. It's actually socializing in virtual spaces can be
Oh,
weirdly relaxing because you're just talking with people and you can open up menus and do stuff. But by and large, you are more present socially in virtual spaces than you are
that's interesting.
in some cases in physical spaces, which again is a very, very, very short period of time when this is possible. Um, and I think that by the time when we really talk about this technology as something, as Peter, a part of the media ecosystem that humans use every day, it won't be like this anymore because the thing that makes it not work is the blindfolding, the fact that your senses is in one world and your body's in another, and all of the things that we experience apart from the rare, like as rare as a person watching a movie, which in our case is every day, but most cases maybe once a week, twice a week, watch a movie. That will be the kind of like, should we go in fully inside of this virtual space
Right.
and do this escape room thing or whatever it is, watch this concert or something? Whereas all of the other times, it's going to be a hybrid experience where this body relationship is not going to be ever even mentioned again, I think.
Yeah.
Obviously, the fact that you can look down on your body and you see it where it is, but you have feathers instead, or you look completely different, or everything might look different. But obviously, removing the senses from the body has some interesting side effect that some people are after, but by and large, no one really wants that. It's a shortcoming of this technology rather than anything else, I think.
As you're saying that, I'm sort of realizing that you both are kind of perfect designers to be designing in these spaces because you're not just designing virtual spaces, you also design physical buildings, furniture, exhibitions outside of those spaces, which we'll talk about in a second. But all of that work that you do, whether it's physical or virtual, is so exuberant. It's colorful. It's loud. It's uh, for lack of a better phrase, it has style. It is playing with the surface itself, and when we are in a virtual spatial experience that is all surface, really, um, certain concerns about usability, about ergonomic, all of those things are less of focus because it is this simulation, and it makes the surface all the more important because it's all style, it's all surface. You've talked before about how there are no minimalist buildings in these spaces because it needs to kind of have style. Can you talk to me about how you think about
Mhm.
style, about surface, about the visual representations of these buildings when in virtual space, when it's all just visual representations, it's all this sort of simulation? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, you cannot talk about this without putting the moment or like how we think about architecture today in context. And you need to put it in context of the modern movement and the many misunderstandings of the modern movement in the 20th century, also like post-war architecture. and how there was this illusion that some of these buildings, no, that one would call being part of the modern movement, that they are just serving the functions, or they are like machines to inhabit, or whatever many of these architects chose to call them, to pat themselves in the shoulder as like we are doing the right thing. And I mean, there were many things that were done right, but we actually, going back to freestyle for a second, something that emerged as well from that exhibition and that we haven't done so much with yet, but we were saying that like part of the interiors, especially the domestic interiors of the modern movement, owe its existence to television, that they would not have been possible without the forms of entertainment that came with television. And I speak about entertainment as basically what puts the human mind at ease, no? Or like what feeds the mind, not just to be entertained, but meaning like literally your mind needs to rest on something. Usually it's on something visual. And when like you speak about like people would say now, a minimalist interior, which is again some strand from the misunderstood modern movement, then it's like, yeah, okay, you put yourself in a white room, and that's literally like the definition of a space of isolation, literally a prison. No, if you weren't able to have books, to have screens, to have audio that you are listening to. So one thing that became quite clear when we started, not so much building things in virtual space, but more like when we were looking at what people was building, that they were building these replicas of existing spaces, because they come with all the baggage of assumptions of what you are going to do inside them, and they're building the replica is so incredibly interesting, no? And like, yeah, most people is no, but it could be upside down, and it could be, and it's like, no, the more referential it can be, the more interesting it will be. So we we use polychromy, we load spaces with a lot of visual information, and we're quite interested in that. And then, I mean, when we do that in virtual spaces, we do that when we work as well with textiles. We work a lot with printed textiles. And maybe we do that as well when we build interiors or when we build buildings for somebody. But we're always gauging how much of that, depending on the way that that space is going to be inhabited. So, for example, if you're building someone's house, and that person is gonna have to be able to deploy themselves as well into that space. But perhaps when you're building a virtual space, the more cues you can manage to put in without overloading it, or while maintaining its legibility, with in our like reasoning, the more interesting it is for us if we can load this palimpsest with all these layers of information.
And it's something that that architectural methods and theory have really prepared us for also, because if you go back only a few hundred years, the idea of thinking about the surface of architecture and the substance of architecture as two separate things,
right,
was like in the 19th century, when at least in the European context, when Gottfried Semper proposed this idea, people like lost their minds. Like, no, like you cannot think like that. And even it's hard to put your mind in hearing a theory and being shocked by it, because this is something that is so
yeah,
obvious to us now, that we think about the surface of things we see as they're never the same thing as the actual thing, or very rarely they are. And it doesn't just go for virtual things. Buildings we see, and like we understand that things we see are thin. Just the fact that like a marble building 1,000 years ago was marble all the way through, and that's the way we built with that material. Whereas now we only build with that material as thin as it could possibly get. It is, less than a finger thin, I think that way of thinking, like, obviously set itself in the way that we understand spaces. So when we think about surfaces in virtual spaces, or the fact that spaces are now covered in screens, I think by and large, not just for people that go around thinking about this, but it's not such a shocking idea. But obviously, like, being inside of a virtual space poses new ways of thinking about this, because what is the surface? If you imagine that it is actually a space, it's a simulation of a space that has different surfaces within them. But again, we are architects working in this world, both through theory but obviously we are decades into people playing video games, so this is also so not a new thought for most people, like,
Right.
so again, we're kind of like analyzing this after the fact, let's say. But there's still many ways that to think about this that are still kind of not clear to us, and they're still strange to think about. I mean, the fact that what Lara was talking about with the TV eating all the visual aspects of our home, for instance, like, you often hear from architects, and they would love to credit themselves that the brilliant architects of the modern movement are the ones that put forward this genius idea, and that's why we all live like this now. And it's like, hell no. Like, you try and live in a modernist box without a TV or a smartphone or anything, and it is literally, like Lara said, the definition of a prison.
Or live that lifestyle also, no, of
Yeah.
being indoors so much. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me ask you two questions about that. I feel like I keep describing your work or talking about your work in this binary. You do virtual things, you do physical things. Do you think about it that way? How do these actually just are these just different outputs of the same strand of thinking? How do you actually talk about this holistic body of your work, the virtual spaces, the furniture, the buildings? Do you see differences there?
Yeah, maybe there are definitely things to say about how they are linked, but I would first say I think that we maybe actually, or I at least see fewer parallels than one maybe would imagine
Oh,
between
interesting.
working both virtually and physically in this time, again, when the technology looks the way it looks. And when we have designed spaces, be that interiors or buildings, obviously I think style and other things certainly come from the fact that we work in both worlds. We have different ways of thinking, etc. But I do think that actually the influences are maybe less than also I would imagine. Like, it kind of shows a lot when in teaching as well, because right now we're teaching this master on so I said, what we're defining as transmedia spaces, transmedia architecture, and quite often we do see fewer parallels than one would imagine, and because I don't know, like, you imagine sort of, what would buildings be like if everyone that's walking around in them has a personal AR device, and we've thought about this and sort of tried to, both in our practice and with students, try to imagine what would buildings be like, and honestly, fewer fewer kind of interesting results come up than you would. They kind of, and maybe Lara, I think Lara maybe has some things to say in the other direction maybe, but we often speak about this sort of QR code city, that if all of the visual aspects of a city comes through your own personal device, what does it matter if a building, what colors it has, or what it looks like to you and in a way, like, maybe this building's being covered with screen is the beginning of that, like, as long as there's a screen there, and if you're wearing the screen on your face or if it's on the
Right.
building
Oh, that's
itself,
interesting.
matters a little bit less. And to be honest, I do in many ways see how this could be possible, because it's literally what's been happening. Like, the insane boredom of a lot of the buildings that are getting built today are because of the media we have access to. Like, if you try to propose the type of modernist buildings that are getting built now. If you try to propose that 200 years ago, people will just think that you're mad.
Yeah.
Like, what are you doing? Like, we will all just not be able to live around these boring buildings because people were actually looking at them and they were actually part of your very limited visual experience when you didn't have access to media like we do today.
Right. Right.
But by and large now, what buildings look like does matter less and less. It doesn't mean obviously people save up to travel to Venice or to places where it's about that, but in their usual regular life, I see we all already may be potentially on the way to this kind of reality. So
Yeah.
again, coming back to our own work, like we are very interested in the tactile aspects of architecture, and actually, this is one thing that's come up a lot with our work with virtual spaces is that we realized that the more you wear a headset, the more interested you are in tactility and what things feel like, because
Oh,
you're so
interesting.
focused on touching things, and we see it a lot in virtual spaces. People are paying loads of money to get their full body tracking suits
Oh,
so
yeah.
that they can lie in bed, their physical bed and a virtual bed at the same time, where people can be dancing or touching things or touching each other. People spend a lot of time in designing their avatar's hair so that it has a special feel.
Mm.
So like this is, you know, some aspects where we see the kind of in our work that there are parallels where we learn a lot, but we haven't like designed like the perfect chair for doing VR, and I know we're our minds don't go in that direction necessarily, which obviously is one way of thinking about it, but
I mean, you're talking more about the way you think about what the impact will
yeah,
be,
rather than
whereas,
our own work, yeah,
or no, rather than the question of this, how do we, yeah, well, how do we see this physical virtual binary? And the more I think about it, it's like, is that even the right way? Like, because something physical can also be a virtual representation of something else, because the definition of the virtual is that which is something in essence, but not in its entirety, no, sort of. So I can be virtually representing somebody also. And then, so what are we talking? I mean, then it's like, if it's not physical virtual binary, but maybe real virtual binary, then that I'm quite interested in, because I think there is layers of that in anything, whether it is physically built or is digitally simulated. And I just get more interested in like what it depends on the vocabulary that we are using. And so
Right.
then the question is like, how do I think about something that is going to be constructed out of physical resources, put together with different types of glues and joints? Or how am I going to think about something that is
Mm.
put together as a 3D model and experienced through specific hardware? It's like, well, some criteria is similar, and some criteria is different. And the things that are different come from the consciousness of the resources that are going to be used. And I think I can be more accurately conscious of the physical resources, like physical materials that are put together, than the physical resources that are needed to create a
Yeah.
virtual experience. And that's where maybe I do things differently in virtual space, because I'm less aware, because I still cannot do that accounting of
I,
resources.
yeah, I mean that's really interesting, and that's sort of why I was saying it's like this binary, like it's easy to
Real.
resort to this binary, but it doesn't quite feel accurate or complete in some way. And you started answering my kind of sub question there,
Mm.
and I was curious about how designing in virtual spaces has that had any influence on when you're designing outside of those spaces. And I don't necessarily mean, Fredrik, like you just said, like, oh, let's design the perfect chair for for gaming or for being in this
yeah,
space. You've done a lot of research and writing around Venn rooms, which is sort of like these physical spaces that would connect to each other, like people could connect to each other in virtual space. I'm not really even talking about that, but more just when you're designing a building that has
yeah,
nothing
yeah.
to do with any of this, are there things from that other side that have changed how you approach the physicality of building, whether that's style, materiality, all those things you're talking about? But like, how do you have you noticed a transference of process or ideas there?
Yeah, maybe there's a few aspects.
I would say there is one key thing that is I was mentioning earlier the word affordance, which is
Hmm.
borrowed from no video game design, but also
Yeah.
from graphic design.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very much. It's not a word that is so common in architecture. But when you apply it to architecture, which is where architecture is much more background than I would say what people call now user experience design, no?
Yeah.
That needs to
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
leading you much more directly, and architecture ideally wouldn't be doing that, although sometimes it does it in terrible ways.
That's a whole
Um,
other conversation that we can get into
yeah.
if you want some other
So,
time.
but like if yes, architecture is background. We are usually taught to think about it in this way, and architecture is shelter, and it's there to house things to happen within it, but not impact them so much. Well, some people teaches you that, some people teaches you
Mhm.
that no, you express all your ideas and you try to be a star architect, but now that is not so much the case.
Right.
Like, so one thing that you really discover when you just take an archetype or typology or type, no, an architectural type, and you make it virtual, you realize the things that it's doing beyond sheltering. No, so
Mm.
like,
Oh,
why
that's
do I need
interesting.
to see it now? My avatar is not gonna get tired. It could just stand, but
Right.
it's not gonna create the ambience. It's not gonna create the context that we are trying to
Yeah.
create, recreate, create. I don't know, no, in this virtual space. So it, in a way, to me, it has taught me so much about all these other things that architecture is doing because I was able to abstract it from its very heavy purpose of like provide shelter, good acoustics, comfort, blah blah blah. So many things it needs to do, right? That then like in the end it's like okay, then it's a space that is making me feel in certain ways, that is activating cues, memories, it's making me relations to other things, and in that is also helping build this thing, that this experience that we are having, and especially when
Yeah.
you're having it together with others. It's very hard to see and analyze that, even though obviously throughout the history of architecture, people has tried to do that endlessly. But for me, somehow it clicked when I saw those things happening with replicas of types or of architectural archetypes in virtual space. And that was the biggest influence, I would say. I don't know that it has changed so much the way I would design things, but probably it has.
That sort of speaks to that question that I asked earlier about kind of how you approach designing in virtual spaces when it's I love that you're using the word experience there. I kept using the word simulation, but it's like it's purely experiential. All those affordances, the acoustics, et cetera, sort of fall away. It's interesting to think about how that kind of flips back.
Mm.
I want to. I think I have like two and a half more questions that I think will kind of summarize a lot of what we've been talking about. And you've mentioned a couple times that you're now teaching. You were appointed professor at the University of Applied Arts Vienna, where you're leading the Architecture Design Studio 2. And I want to talk about teaching in a second, but I actually want to connect this to something that we were talking about earlier, because in the statement when you were appointed to that position, you both said schools of architecture can counter the current neoliberal nature of online space, developing tools and theory to ensure fairness, equity, and ethical operability in the intersection of media with the built environment. They can also be spaces where we imagine alternatives towards responsibility and solidarity in the ways we inhabit our buildings and manage our cities, towns, and villages enabled by media. And Fredrik, you mentioned earlier that, all of these big tech companies are trying to make VR headsets the great Christmas gift, this year. And that's something that I've been thinking about a lot generally, but also in this conversation, that the technology that's driving these spaces are
Mm.
being created largely by, not only, but largely by big multi-billion dollar corporations. There are obviously alternatives there. And the limits of for-profit companies designing this technology, how that influences how we use it, how we access it, who has access to it, what happens in it. You both have written and talked before about the sort of the borders between them, sort of a platform lock-in there, and how do we get beyond that? And I'm wondering how you think, to go back to that statement when you were appointed professors, how how you think about the role of the architect, the role of the designer, the role of people like us who are not necessarily building this tech. How can we design against or work against the kind of platform affordances that these companies are trying to impose upon us? How do you think about architecture and design both as a way to um, resist this, but also as a way to show us different futures?
Yeah, I think to not kind of inflate too much what we are able to do as teachers, or even what generations of students, what they will have influence over. I think it's the most important is just that we should not forget like how these spaces are running, and
Mm,
what's behind them. And obviously we are trying our best to both create awareness, but also to a little bit influence the choices that people make. Like how if you're kind of like in our university here in Vienna, in a historically socialist city, not necessarily country, but
mm,
where it's whenever someone orders something from Amazon, it's kind of mentioned like, yeah, we have to use Amazon in this case because of this and this and this. There's an awareness that like we do this because we either don't have an option in this case, and that does a lot. Like just the awareness that it's like it's mentioned, it doesn't become just the kind of the thing we do. Like, okay,
yeah, yeah,
let's meet in Meta Horizon. It's like, and we pause for a second and realize what we're actually doing. And just like you would kind of when you step into a building where that says above it, some big company that you're
mm,
um we are more prone maybe to be aware of these things in other places. It's pretty unique in this case that there are almost no options. And obviously, the counter argument to this that you hear from the sort of more tech evangelist people are just like this spaces, these things wouldn't exist without this sort of commercialization through these corporations. And our replies are often like, well, then good. Like, why literally the hurry? There is zero purpose to this. I mean, we even speak about the fact that there is a grave danger to the possibilities that might happen to the world if we rush into this new paradigm of media experience,
mm,
akin to what happened to psychedelics in the 60s. And
mm,
I'm not even kidding. Like there might even be
yeah,
like a point where, these CEOs, they show up in Congress not to talk about bullying, but like to stand for, the crimes, and then they all become illegal, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, for many other reasons, we speak often for the fact that like rather that this happens much slower.
yeah,
Um, and
But then also, I mean, in very simple terms, architecture is the design discipline that has been closest to policy since
mm,
forever, no? Because it always was felt that, oh, it has such an impact. And then, like, we forgot that
right,
other fields of design have a massive impact
yeah,
in our
yeah,
lives, and they are not so close to just policy. So, architects have already built in this understanding that they are in dialogue or that they are themselves to become policymakers, and
mm,
especially when you think about urban planners,
yeah,
territorial planners. So what we want to pursue is that that knowledge it's applied now to media as it is having such
yeah,
an impact on the built environment. It should be applied no matter what, but it feels like maybe it's more understandable if we take it from this angle, and that we think it could be extremely beneficial if we treat it in that same way with that same level of care from the point of view of policy. Now, one will also need to be critical about who is writing these policies and how,
right,
because we blindly believed in for decades. or nearly a century is now also being heavily put into question. So also community action and organizing around how do we want to shape these things, if we want them to happen, or if we see them as inevitable, or if we want them to happen, then how should they be shaped,
Because
and
now it's
how
also
should we be
happening.
involved?
Yeah, because now it's also happening to the whole world at the same time. And we're talking, of course, in this specific case about the wealthy parts of the world with this technology, but it's happening, on every continent. This kind of this technology that we're talking about. I mean, quite often when media that turns out to be too powerful and where policy making steps in and either breaks up media empires, as we've seen happen all around the world, where you realize that corporations that control media in one way or another, if it's platforms or literally like news agents or whatever, are too powerful. In this case, the experiences are being rolled out so simultaneously everywhere in the world.
Yeah.
Plus, there's a huge difference, like incomprehensible what sort of data these companies have control over, and it might be that, like, the way that, for instance, now AI personal assistants are being so integrated into people's lives, when this gets combined with these corporations and the fact that it's already so politicized, AI, and it's already a kind of global war, let's say, on starting on this, that it might be hard to go back from this specific media. Whereas like the telephone or telegraph, for instance, that in the US could be nationalized, very important medium, but it was like, okay, now this is too important, we're going to nationalize it. In this case, it might not be possible. Like it might be too complex, too much money involved. And also when states are being weakened, because that's the other thing also, we've always had a kind of maybe narrow-minded idea that the only power we can have any hope in is states stepping in and doing something.
Sweden talking here.
Yeah, no, we have realized that like this perspective of thinking that like policy making through the state is our biggest hope. And then you speak to people in other countries, like literally the only reason I use this is because one of the few places I can be myself without the state.
Yeah.
Places where it's illegal to have certain, So I like basically we see the potential dangers being so enormous that we just have felt that we cannot continue working on this without it becoming a core aspect of both with our practice and students.
So that's a great way to ask my last question, because I'm curious, and this is sort of a broad question, but I'm curious how you think about this is a dumb way to ask this question, but I'll append it later. How you think about like what it means to teach architecture today to these students. I'm thinking back to that first question about how you define architecture and this relationship between architecture and media. I'm thinking about everything we've been talking about with this overlap between the virtual and the physical. And I'm thinking about this policy piece that we're talking about now. How do these come together for you in the classroom? How are you talking about this with students? What are the kind of critical tools that you are trying to equip your students with to be prepared for all of these things that you're talking about?
In the studio with the students, we are trying to like think about all these topics through different cases. No? So one thing that we are very we're very lucky about is that the masters that we teach is 3 years long. That's a very long time.
Yeah.
Where it allows us to do, like, let's say 4 projects in the first 4 semesters, and then the students have still an entire year or maybe more if they want to take a break to do their thesis. No, so you cannot speak about all these topics at once. And it's a sort
Right.
of slow process, and students come with different interests and expectations. Some people really comes because they want to understand how you design these types of spaces, because they have been interns in some architecture office and they really hated it, the type of day to
Yeah.
day, and they're like, oh my God, give me a path to a different type of
Yeah.
career,
Yeah. I've
or
been
I
there.
wanna or I wanna be able to be more independent, or I am very critical of this, or I want to have a practice
Hmm.
that is more kind of in between architecture and media arts. I want to explore these topics. I want to write. I want to work in fiction. I don't know, right? They come from all angles. People who usually has studied architecture, or that they all need to have a degree in architecture, but then see that there is a possibility for other paths. To me, this is the most important thing: is to be like giving them the maybe the possibility, the ideas, maybe the skills, I would hope. But at least like to open paths to be like you could
Yeah.
practice in all of these different ways. And then because we have this luxury of having so much time with them, we can work in this way that I was mentioning earlier, where one semester we might be looking at like, okay, let's design a space for remote gatherings and let's try and think about how we do that well. So very directly thinking like we build a physical space, we build a digital world, we overlap them, we don't overlap them, right? Very hands-on, working with the hardware that aligns with this. And then another semester, we can be thinking about the lifestyles that are enabled through the internet today, and how we can even rethink the way we relate to and make use of territories and the way we organize ourselves politically. Boom, right? And we try to maintain that still within architectural design, but at the larger scales. So architecture, for better or worse, sometimes for worse, but many times for better, touches or like deals with such many different scales that we can go from like literally like designing a piece of
Yeah.
furniture and the space around it, to be thinking about the infrastructure of like 100,000 square
Yeah.
kilometers
Yeah.
territory, or even thinking about borders, or so. By touching in on all those aspects, at least through, let's say, the first 2 years of their education, we hope that there would be hints for everyone to try and think about some of these topics, or if they are unlucky like us, to have to think about all of those topics at the same time and not be able to drop
Right.
any one of them, which is maybe not the best idea, but is what we end
Yeah.
up doing somehow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because as you said, it's so true that both the best and the worst part with the state of architecture, especially architectural education today, is the fact that as a discipline, it's been extremely protective of itself, because in many countries it doesn't have the same legal standing as the other professions that were created in the 19th century, like doctors, lawyers,
Hmm.
etc., etc. But has historically has a lot of respect. And so the reason why you need an architect is constantly put into question. And throughout the 20th century, it became as much a storytelling medium as an actual practical medium,
Mm.
where like the so many gigantic buildings in the world are stand there because the architect was extremely charming, or
Right.
many
Right.
many things have actually made, like, you could see it as a deep rot in the discipline that is just so problematic and dangerous, that which also has made it historically extremely difficult to study architecture, because it can be toxic, has, like, the world
Yeah.
that we have been
Yes.
through, like
Horrible.
Yeah.
most people can't imagine how the what it's like has been like historically to study architecture. And I think largely because of this extremely psychologically messed up way that the discipline has developed. And actually, in some cases, this is its uniqueness as well. Somehow,
Mm.
because it's been so protective,
Yeah.
like an architect that graduates from our master is legally an architect and can go and work and build a skyscraper. But they might also be equipped to make films, to make writings, or to do critical writing about territory, or
Yeah.
and obviously that is in a way a problem, because
I
you might
mean,
not be very good at any of those things.
Yeah, like we're not sure how good the writing or the film will be, but like we know that you are capable of thinking at different scales and to think about interconnected systems, which is roughly what an architect is always doing.
I was trying really hard to end this on a positive note, and I'm not totally sure we did.
No.
Sorry, we can be very doomsday sometimes.
I'm with you. No, I'm with you. I'm with you there. I feel like I'm the same way sometimes. I think the way you're thinking about this is really appealing to me on multiple levels. Both the way you're talking about this with your students, and also the way that you're enacting it in your own work, and the way you are both engaging with these new technologies while also standing apart and being critical, I think is a really compelling position to take. And so I really appreciate you both taking the time to talk to me and being on the show. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much.
We had such a good time. Thank you so much for inviting us. It was really nice.
That was my conversation with Space Popular's Lara Lesmes and Fredrik Hellberg. It was recorded on March 14th, 2025. Our theme music is by Jeremiah Chute. The show is funded thanks to the generosity of listeners like you. If you like what we're doing, I hope you consider supporting us and get some bonus content each month through our Substack. You can follow us across social media at Surface Podcast, and you can listen to all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at our website, scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.